Hey, what's up and welcome everybody to What I Love About. Before we jump straight into the video, I just wanted to take a quick second to kind of explain quickly how this video is going to work and what the concept of this show is. Essentially, it's my take on video game reviews. It's a lot of what you would expect, but there's also a slight little twist as well. So essentially, what I love about is going to have zero scoring of any kind. If a game is on the show, you can go ahead and assume that it's a game that I really enjoy. It's a game that I recommend. Also, I'm going to not spend a ton of time picking apart different criticisms and critiques surrounding the game. The whole point of the video is to discuss what I love about a particular game, so that's going to be the main focal point. I will also spend a little bit more time than perhaps usual discussing the developers themselves as people, where they come from, how they got to where they are, and what they've been doing essentially in their careers. I find that stuff very interesting. I also like to inject a little bit of video game history to kind of provide context for the reasonings and how I got to the point where I've got to in terms of how much I love a specific game. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. It's a little bit different than a traditional review, but yeah, we'll see. Anyways, I don't want to take up too much more time, so I hope you enjoy the video, and yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Have a good one. Remember to have fun. Pong. Just listening to its primitive yet soothing sound effects is equal part historic as it is hypnotic. It's a sound effect that most gamers recognize as being the origin of their favorite hobby, and for the most part that's true. While a lot of people's first experience with Pong was actually in an arcade, the game actually really blew up with the release of the first home consoles, with the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972 and the classic Atari 2600 in 1977. This date in particular will go down as one of the most impactful moments in the early days of video games, especially video game consoles, as people started to realize that you can have awesome gaming experiences without having to travel outside of your home and into an arcade. However, before these consoles came out, there actually were still some people playing video games outside of the arcade. A lot of people actually were able to use these huge mainframe computer systems originally intended for data storage at local universities or community colleges, and they were using them to play games well before that big black and brown box sat on top of your TV. But they weren't playing Pong, however, no. The games they played were inspired not by a white ball bouncing around a black screen, but instead by a big red book. One of the most important books in our history.
It began as a cult phenomenon, then it caught on. Now a new game is sweeping the country.
You will burn forever and ever in eternal torment. You are no more.
The role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons debuted in 1974. It became a hit with many adolescents, but critics claimed it was an invitation to devil worship.
The witchcraft, the demonism, the spells.
And worse.
It is not fun and games.
The media set off a satanic panic.
A lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders.
That connection has been largely debunked.
It's nothing but a witch hunt.
And the game has generated an unexpected legacy.
This was a revolution.
For those who are not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, it's essentially a tabletop role-playing game released in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, where one player acts as a dungeon master, guiding the rest of the players through a storyline of their own creation within the confines of a world and rule set laid out by the player's handbook. How the game responds to player choices, everything from how an NPC Okay, maybe I'll save the Dungeons & Dragons talk for another time, but the book itself was a revolutionary way to express your creativity at the time, and unsurprisingly, people interested in finding creative uses for their university or community's mainframe computers were drawn to the book and the ability for it to create awesome gameplay experiences. These people were quick to try and find ways to convert this pen and paper experience into a digital one. Games like Moria for the Plato mainframe system released in 1975, 3 whole years before the Atari 2600, and that game looked to capture the exploration, the combat, the RPG mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons, and the result is significantly less rudimentary than you might think. However, other games wanted to try and focus on a different core element of Dungeons & Dragons, and that element is storytelling. Colossal Cave Adventure, developed for the PDP-10 mainframe system in 1976, was the first of its kind. It was a text-based computer adventure game that stripped out all the combat, all the RPG mechanics, all the exploration, and focused entirely on telling a story. This game would go on to influence the entire adventure game genre, which would lead us to some of the most popular games of the decades ahead. Companies like LucasArts and Sierra Online would become gaming juggernauts in the 80s, and they would release some of the decade's most iconic games. Sierra's Mystery House was actually designed, written, and illustrated by Roberta Williams, a gaming luminary who was one of the industry's first ever female game designers. The game would come out in 1980, and it would set the blueprint for other smash hits like Maniac Mansion, Monkey Island, and King's Quest. And that's not all. Other very influential RPGs, including Bard's Tale, Wasteland, Fallout, and Ultima, would all make their debuts here. It's at this time that D&D would also make its way to Japan for the first time, right as the Japanese people would start to get their hands on their very first home computers with the NEC PC 8001 and the Fujitsu FM7. In fact, a young up-and-coming game developer named Yuji Horii would go on to write and design his first ever video game called the Portopia Serial Murder Case, which he said was directly inspired by Western text adventures of the past. Before, going on to create, the world's largest Japanese RPG franchise in the world, Dragon Quest. You might have heard of it. And then after the 80s, of course, we fly right into the 90s, which would mark the debut and first project of legendary game developer Tim Shafer with Day of the Tentacle, which he would then follow up with Full Throttle, and then release one of the best adventure games of all time, one of my personal favorites, and the game that got me into the genre in the first place, the wonderful and fantastic Grim Fandango.
Buenos dias.
All of these games are on Game Pass, by the way, in their remastered form, so I highly recommend you check those out. But after the 90s, we fly directly into the new millennium with the 2000s, which would bring us even more emotionally charged stories, led by the very, very talented team at Telltale Games with their release of The Walking Dead, a seminal game that actually went on to win Game of the Year when it released. And since then, the genre is still thriving to this day, with big AAA releases like Life is Strange and Detroit Become Human. All of these fantastic adventures can trace their roots back to that often overlooked moment in gaming history where a big red book with a dragon on the cover helped spark the biggest entertainment industry in the world, inspiring the people responsible for creating our favorite games to this day. Telling a story is something that is just so natural. It's part of what makes us human. And whether it's movies, TV shows, books, or games, it's just timeless to hear a good story. However, what's even more rare than just simply surviving the test of time is at the same time getting better with age. As more people get a chance to write stories, we get more creative ideas from more creative people. As technology increases, so does the fidelity of the worlds that these designers build. And as animation technology increases, we're able to see more emotion in the faces of our characters and better portray how they're feeling and what they're thinking. The stories told in video games just keep getting better and better, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. Which brings us to right now, and why I'm so happy to talk to you today about a new adventure game developed by Variable State and published by the critically acclaimed film production company Annapurna Interactive. Without further ado, everybody, allow me to tell you what I love about Last Stop. Last Stop is developed by Variable State and published by Annapurna Interactive. Variable State is a small European indie studio based in both London, England and Dublin, Ireland, founded by well-traveled developers Jonathan Burroughs and Terry Kenny, both of who've met while serving as senior designer and animator respectively at DeepMind Technologies in London. During their time at DeepMind, they bonded over a shared love for the indie game scene at the time, specifically following the development and release of titles like Gone Home and Kentucky Route Zero. They became envious of people being able to create these incredibly personal experiences, games that were so far removed from the commercialization of the AAA games industry, and instead boldly veered much closer to conventional art. What started out as a hobby project in their spare time began to evolve and grow into something bigger and bigger, when suddenly, in an act of fate, Google acquired DeepMind Technologies, causing their current positions at the company to become redundant, and both of them were sadly let go. With about a year's worth of savings between the two of them, and a pair of extremely understanding and supporting partners, they both agreed to take a leap of faith and do the riskiest thing any game developer could decide to do, which is to found their own studio, Variable State. Last Stop is the sophomore outing for Variable State, with their first outing being the Writers Guild award-winning adventure game, Virgina, a feat that is actually quite remarkable given that the game's characters in Virginia have no spoken dialogue and the entire story plays out through non-verbal cues. Now that we know the artist, let's take a deep dive into the art. As alluded to earlier, Last Stop is an adventure game with a very strong emphasis on characters and story, more so than frenetic gameplay and action. The game is structured in such a way where there are 3 playable characters who each have their own storyline that play out kind of like episodes of 3 different TV shows, but they get more and more interwoven with each other as each storyline progresses. The 3 storylines are titled Paper Dolls, Domestic Affairs, and Stranger Danger, and at the beginning of the game, you will see our 3 main characters, John Smith, Mina Hughes, and Donna Adeleke, sitting on a transit bus, waiting for you to choose what story you'd like to play first. The stories are broken down into episodes, and you can play these episodes in any order, but once you complete the first episode with one character, you must complete each other character's first episode before unlocking the second one for everyone else. Each storyline will drop you into the complicated lives of each of these characters right at the moment where a little drop of sci-fi gets introduced into their day-to-day, and that little drop will snowball bigger and bigger as each episode plays out. In Paper Dolls, you will play as John Smith, a down-and-out single father who, in a way to try to cope with the tragic loss of his wife, forgoes his mental health and ambition and instead focuses all of his energy into his daughter Molly. After a chance encounter with a mysterious stranger and Jack, John's polar opposite athletic, ambitious neighbor, John switches bodies with Jack, and the two are forced to try and find out how this happened and how to get things back to normal. In Domestic Affairs, you play as Mina Hughes. Former military, now working for a shadowy corporation, Mina is cold, ruthless, and an egomaniac. She has a family that she vaguely cares about, but is also in the middle of a secret affair. In her story, she's fighting for a promotion against another employee and must do her best to undermine her competition while at the same time keeping her family in the dark. In Stranger Danger, you play as Donna Adeleke, who is a teenage girl going through normal, everyday teenage girl things. At least what my understanding of teenage girl things are. I mean, I'm not an expert or anything like that, but she's rebellious against her mother and her older sister and only focused on her friends. One night, while out with her friends, they decide to follow a strange man who had been skulking about the neighborhood. They follow him into an abandoned building where they witness him doing something that can only be described as outer worldly. When the man is alerted to their presence, the three of them end up panicking, attacking the man, knocking him unconscious, and tying him to a chair. As the three of them freak out, trying to find out how they're going to be able to get away with this, the man wakes up and is unnervingly calm, almost as if he wanted to be captured. All three of these stories are great, the writing is good, and they all do a great job of making the player get invested with these characters. I will say, though, that Paper Dolls is the clear frontrunner, as I just connected with that story immediately, and honestly, I sometimes found myself eager to finish the other 2 episodes of the other stories so I could get right back into John's story with Paper Dolls. It was very good. I would stand in line to see that movie if it ever became one. In what has become somewhat of a calling card for variable state games, their use of real-time cinematic editing, often found in film, makes its presence known early and often. It was a great addition to Virginia, but they clearly wanted to level it up in Last Stop, and partnering with the games publishing arm of indie film company Annapurna Pictures was clearly a decision that paid dividends. I started with John's story, and right away I was taken aback by the use of framing and truck shots as John walks from one room to another in his house. Being a video game, you kind of have it easy, as you don't need to, build an apartment set that's missing a wall to achieve this effect. But even still, immersive shots like this are often overlooked in video games, especially indie video games with lower budgets. So its presence here was really cool to me. In fact, with me admittedly being a little bit of a film buff, it's scenes like this in particular that really inspired me to do this whole review in the first place. It doesn't stop there though. There are Hollywood techniques around every corner with every story in Last Stop. Whether it's putting the camera in a drawer that's being opened, similar to the trunk shot in Reservoir Dogs, or while a character is walking through a crowded area, the game will blur the faces of all the background characters to keep the important ones in the player's focus, similar to the umbrella scene in Godzilla. These little things all add up to what I would consider to be fantastic cinematic presentation. While it might not have the same quality animations as an Insomniac game, or the visual fidelity of something from the Coalition, the small team at Variable State's smart use of what they could do with the budget they had elevates this game above its contemporaries for me. The visual elements of any adventure game is what separates it from adventure games of days past, but the storylines and the writing is the through line that connects something like this to something as far back as Colossal Cave Adventure on the PDP-10 mainframe computer system way back in 1976, and the writing here really resonated with me personally. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not Shakespearean or anything like that, but the writers here were able to create very real-feeling characters and inject a ton of great humor into this game. John's daughter Molly actually had me chuckling a bit, although I might be a bit biased as I do also have a daughter around that age, but her childhood bluntness was really well realized for me.
Cheers.
Jack, your clothes look mental.
What? No, they're not.
I'm not sure he wants fashion advice from us, eh?
They're so tight, doesn't your will get pinched?
Funny kid. Anyway, I have to go. Nice seeing you both.
She also taught me a very valuable lesson in which chicken fingers are actually referred to as chicken dippers in the United Kingdom, something that will come in handy if I ever need to order lunch across the pond.
So, chicken dippers for dinner?
How about a nice Caesar salad instead?
Wow, get you, Jamie Oliver.
One scene in particular that stands out early was John struggling with telephone tech support at the office, and it might just be my particular sense of humor, but this one almost had me in tears.
Oh, come on.
For Pete's sake!
print, you bastard!
Hello, welcome to technical support. To help us with your query, in your own words, please describe your problem.
The paper is jammed in the printer and I can't get it out.
Thanks. Did you say you would like to upgrade your account?
The printer doesn't work.
I'll put you through to one of our support team advisors.
Finally.
We are currently experiencing a high number of calls. You are number 164 in the queue. Please hold.
There are a lot of other moments like this in the game. It's an engaging story with engaging characters from start to finish that's not afraid to crack a few jokes. And none of it overstays its welcome either, as each episode is somewhat brisk and deliberate with its delivery, as the game's entire runtime is only around 6 to 7 hours. I've talked a lot so far about the visual experience of Last Stop, but the awesome camera work, awesome characters, and fantastic writing are actually all held together by a great soundtrack. Detroit Become Human is, in my opinion, the pinnacle of what a modern adventure game can be. It's the last time a studio was given a considerable budget and team to pull out all the stops and simply just tell a great story. One of the things they did to accomplish this was to lean heavy into the audio presentation, and I'm not talking about voice performances, although they were fantastic in Detroit Become Human, but instead I'm talking about the music. Detroit had a similar structure to Last Stop in that it had 3 protagonists that the player controlled through 3 separate yet interconnected storylines. However, in an effort to add greater distinction to these 3 unique characters in Detroit and their unique storylines, studio head David Cage did something quite unprecedented. He contracted 3 separate composers, Nima Fakara, Philip Shepard, and Marvel Spider-Man's theme composer John Pisano, to write each character their own unique theme music. And he only gave each composer the specific details on their assigned character so that they were untainted with the knowledge of the grander scope of the game and its characters. This plan worked flawlessly, as the theme music dedicated to each character in Detroit Become Human fits absolutely perfectly with their story, their motives, and their character, and adds to the great immersion found in Detroit Become Human. Now, obviously a small indie team is not going to be able to hire 3 different composers. That would actually represent roughly 1/5 of the entire workforce at Variable State, but composer Lyndon Holland really was able to take advantage of that same philosophy, albeit in a solo effort. John's theme music is somewhat aloof and calming, with very laid-back strings embodying his everyday dad life, a boring mix of collared shirts, cubicles, and transit rides, with a bit of high-pitched keys sprinkled in on top as the musical equivalent of chasing his daughter around the block. Mina's music is full of stress and unease. The strings create a lot of tension, and some of the woodwind sounds add a sense of slyness to the melody. It reminds me a lot of the intro theme to House of Cards, which is fitting because Mina's character and Frank Underwood share a lot of common qualities. Donna's story revolves a lot around the mystery surrounding the stranger, and the music reflects that very well. The music slowly elevates as if getting closer to an answer, and uses higher pitch instruments playing homage to the youthfulness of the characters throughout this story. All in all, the music is great in Last Stop. Both the emotional moments and humorous moments are dramatically elevated because of it. Hats off to the composer, Lyndon Holland. You did a fantastic job with this one. Finally, the last thing I really loved about Last Stop is the world, or more specifically, the world building. The game takes place in modern-day London, at least from what I can tell as a modern-day Canadian who's never quite crossed the pond. They do a good job at creating a cartoon reimagining of London, and it felt like a real place to me. What makes the whole world come together though and feel like that real place is how the developers use environmental storytelling to tie the three story threads together in a believable way. For instance, in one scene you're walking down the road as Mina and you see John looking depressed at a bus stop just waiting to go home after a long day at the office. Or early on you find out Mina's husband is a teacher through various conversations, only to find out a few episodes later that he is actually Donna's teacher. There are many of these instances, and they're fun to pick out as you get further and further down the rabbit hole of these characters. Not often do they add significantly to the mystery at hand, they just serve to simply tie down these characters into the game's world, and I really enjoyed that. As much as I loved Last Stop, there are a few things I would love to see improved in future releases from Variable State. Firstly, I perhaps like to see some better transitions between cutscene and gameplay. There were often a lot of times where I would be watching a cutscene, which are all in-engine scenes, and then it would end, and my character would just kind of be standing still waiting for me to retake control. The cutscenes blend so seamlessly with the gameplay that it's almost imperceptible when they've ended, and it just creates those awkward 3 to 5 seconds of nothing happening. Well, your brain starts to let in the uncanny valley effect, and you pick up your controller to start playing again. Something as simple as shooting the cutscenes in a 2:39:1 cinematic aspect ratio and having black bars that disappear when reverting back to gameplay at 16:9 would work, albeit at the cost of immersion. Perhaps there's a more elegant approach, but whatever they decide to do, I think it would really help their next game. Another thing I'd suggest is to be okay with telling a linear story. I enjoy choosing dialogue options and progressing stories as much as the next person, but there are some cases in this game where the options you choose, although they seem different, all end up effectively resulting in the same thing being said or the same action being taken. I would not say that these false choices have really ever impacted my enjoyment of the game or my engagement with the story, but if I had the choice, I would have preferred to have not been given a dialogue option if it didn't have a somewhat drastic change in what the outcome of the conversation was or what the outcome of the scene was. It's better to tell a linear story guiding the player through the ebbs and flows of your work than it is to create the illusion of choice to try and keep your player engaged from a gameplay perspective. Players play an adventure game to experience a great story, so I wouldn't be too afraid to lean heavier into that and not worry so much about the gameplay, at least in my opinion. Overall, I quite enjoyed the time I spent with Last Stop. Variable State really did punch well above their weight from a storytelling and cinematic perspective, telling a compelling story with great music and well-written characters, all of which are exactly what you want on a great adventure game. I also absolutely loved the lengths they were willing to go to tie these three stories together in the end. It was definitely a bold move to take the story to that place, making the game that much more memorable. I won't spoil what happens, but trust me, this is a game you absolutely will want to see through until the end. The team at Variable State has quickly risen to the top of my indie studio watch list with Last Stop, and I can't wait to experience what's next from the talented people over there. Well done. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Hopefully it inspires some people to check out the great story that is Last Stop. If you did enjoy it, liking, subscribing, and commenting helps get the word out, as my #1 goal is to have someone who worked on the game check this video out. The What I Love About series is just as much for developers receiving great feedback when they make great games as it is for people looking for more information on a particular title. Thanks again. I look forward to making more of these. Remember to have fun out there, everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.